Well, just because I have a bit of a glutton for punishment, I am still the director of the Tim Training course until the end of this year, as well as starting a part-time PhD because I have nothing else to do with my spare time. And I see a few students, or ex-students, actually current and former Tim course students among us. So if you'd like to know anything more about that, you can chat with one of them or myself later. Well, we're going to cover, I hope, and what I suspect to be quite a lot of ground in the time that we have, which is why I've given you a set of notes that includes some of the longer quotes that I'm going to refer to. And as you'll see in the headings, we're going to do a cultural survey, a historical survey, and then land on a biblical survey, which will have two parts to it. One would be a biblical explanation for our moment in history, and then a timeless biblical alternative. I would say, just as a way of acknowledgement, if you are not familiar with Carl Trueman's books, everything I'm going to say, Carl says way better than I could ever dream of saying. So his book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, is highly recommended. And yet, this year, he's come out with a book called Strange New World, which is not really an abridgment of this book, but a more digestible, anyway, it's not, you can't really call it an abridgment, but it is basically a more digestible version of everything you'll find in here. So I would highly recommend those to you. You'll see some quotes and footnotes from those as we go. Our cultural survey, where we are at this particular moment in history, and some of the things that I think will sound extremely familiar to anybody who doesn't live in a cave. These concepts that we're surrounded with in our world today on what it means to be a self in the modern sense of the word. You'll see here a quote from Carl. The modern self assumes the authority of inner feelings and sees authenticity as defined by the ability to give social expression to the same. The modern self also assumes that society at large will recognize and affirm this behavior. So, in defining the modern self, what does it mean to be who I am? I think it would be hard to argue against the idea that in our world today, almost universally, it is suggested, in fact it's more than suggested, it's largely argued, that I am who I feel myself to be. My feelings determine who I am. And to add to that, not only does it determine who I am, but I expect everyone to acknowledge that and to recognize that and to not present me with any other alternative view. How could somebody possibly claim that I am not who I feel myself to be? And of course, we have terms now that are even used in our world when somebody does perhaps argue against that, and what we would say, that you'll be canceled, right? We add a new term to our vocabulary in cancel culture, which is what happens when someone suggests a different way of thinking that goes against the self-identified narrative. Not to get sidetracked on this, of course, but we've seen this in the last 24 hours in Melbourne, where a gentleman can have to leave a prominent position as on the board of directors of a football club just simply because of the church he attends. He's not even a pastor. And these things are continuing. We may talk about that in the Q&A. Add to that, beyond just simply the modern definition of what it means to be a self, a person, we add to that another concept which is, again, very prevalent, though we may not necessarily use the term. This term, expressive individualism. Expressive individualism holds that each person has a unique core of feeling and intuition that should unfold or be expressed if individuality is to be realized. So, not only do I define myself, my identity, by how I feel, but I must be able to express that without any restraints. Or we might say, certainly with limited restraints. And there are fewer and fewer restraints, seemingly almost every year. Things that would have been considered inconceivable about personal expression, especially in matters of sexual practice and sexual identity, even just 5 years ago, today would be considered equally crazy to question. And there are almost no limits. In fact, I would suggest to you that particularly from the school age and high school age on up, when it comes to education regarding sexuality today, there really is only one limit left, and that is consent. It's basically absolutely anything, any way of expressing yourself in matters of sexual identity or sexual practice is completely, not only is it accepted, it's actually encouraged. The only remaining barrier is just consent. As long as there's consent, anything is absolutely not only tolerated, it's celebrated. That's a massive change that's taken place, and I'm not that old, in our lifetime. You'll notice another, tying these concepts together, is thinking about the sexual revolution and sexual fulfillment. And now again, here's what we need to think, because I would say in my generation, when anybody used the term sexual revolution, that was a term that exclusively referred to the 1960s. I mean, it was almost used interchangeably. Yeah. Sexual revolution, 1960s. People today, I think, are coming to understand that the larger concept of sexual revolution is far more significant than just the decade of the 60s. In fact, there have been, really, you might say, revolutions in our understanding of sexuality and sexual practice that go back way, 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 way back before the 1960s and have only been continuing to grow increasingly so in the last 20 years. And so thinking about this in our current setting, here's another quote for you. The sexual revolution does not simply represent a growth in the routine transgression of traditional sexual mores, or even a modest expansion of the boundaries of what is and is not acceptable sexual behavior. That might be a definition for the 1960s, that version of the sexual revolution, where it was really just a pushing the boundaries of going against your parents' puritanical understanding of what was allowed sexually. But moving on from the 60s, we see how things are blown to where we are today. As Carl goes on and says, not at all. This is not an adequate definition for what we would understand as what is revolutionized sexuality and sexual practice today. Rather, it is the repudiation of the very idea of such codes in their entirety. More than that, it has come in certain areas, such as that of homosexuality and transgenderism, to require the positive repudiation of traditional sexual mores to the point where belief in or maintenance of such views has come to be seen as ridiculous and even a sign of serious mental or moral deficiency. And to understand this, we need to see the sexual revolution as a particularly sharp manifestation of the characteristics of expressive individualism. If the individual's inner identity is defined by sexual desire, then he or she must be allowed to act out that desire in order to be an authentic person. So, there would have been a day where, again, somebody might push the boundaries of sexual practice, and you would even hear the terms like, well, as long as no one gets hurt. It's what's good for me is good for me, what's good for you is good for you. We can have differing views as long as, again, no one gets hurt. Not today. Today it's actually to even suggest that there might be a different perspective on sexuality and sexual practice is considered to be really the definition of bigotry. It becomes a new definition of what is considered evil. What is considered evil today is to suggest that there might even be some boundaries to sexuality and sexual practice. And again, we see that in our modern culture and media. We see that people's livelihoods are brought into question, their continuation in employment, whether or not they will be recognized for positions within academic institutions are determined by whether or not they will toe the line, echo these new creeds of society, which are confessed with really quite strong rhetoric. And so we can ask ourselves, how did we get here? We were observing things in our culture Some of us in the room may think what I've talked about so far is great, no problem. This is where we have longed to see culture go. And in one sense, that's okay, except even then, one needs to recognize that this didn't happen overnight. And in fact, this is actually the fruit of thoughts that have been happening throughout, really, actually going back hundreds of years, which we won't have time nearly to exhaust all of that. But we can certainly trace some of the massive leaps in our cultural transition really through the 20th century. And much of this, in the more recent iterations of it, can be traced back really to the mid-20th century and to a gentleman by the name of Sigmund Freud. And so I'm going to move on to a historical survey, particularly on pages 2 and 3, as we consider another, this is a much longer quote, obviously, by a lady named Rosaria Butterfield. And I would say, again, there are lots of people in this world who say things better than I do. Rosaria is on the top of the list. If you've never heard of her, look her up. If you haven't seen any of her resources, I highly encourage you to do so. Just a quick little bio on her. Rosaria was, as you see in the bottom of the quote on page 3, she was a tenured professor of English and women's studies at Syracuse University. She was a practicing homosexual or lesbian, living in lesbian relationships. She was just, by her own admission, violently outspoken against anything that would remotely sound like Christian. She trained a generation of, university feminist scholars on how to write against Christianity. And then she was beginning to write a book to basically just completely discredit everything Christianity teaches about sexuality. And in doing so, a local pastor encouraged her, actually, maybe it would be good if you read the Bible. If you're going to argue against it, you probably ought to read it. So she started reading it. She became a Christian. And her life has been utterly turned upside down. She lost her job, she lost her relationships, she lost her friends, she lost everything because of her turning away from her former life to Christianity. She's now married to a pastor. But in saying all of that, she knows what she's talking about. So when she writes about these things, she's writing about everything that she once believed and taught and wrote about herself. So when she says things like you'll see in this quote, I'm also a scholar of the 19th century, a whole book history of ideas, former professor of English, though now only professors from the homeschool table. And like others of my ilk, I know that sexual orientation is an invented category of personhood. Indeed, even from the old feminist perspective that I sported back in the day, I knew that sexual orientation as an identity was a category mistake. The concept of sexual orientation was first used by Sigmund Freud, and its effect, if not intent, was to radically resituate sexuality from its creational, biblical context to something completely new. The foundational drive that determines and defines human identity. Nothing short of personhood was at stake. By defining humanity according to sexual desires and segregating it according to its gendered object, Freud was, intentionally or not, suppressing the biblical category of being made in the image of God, made in God's image, male and female, and replacing it with an invented category, that of sexual identity. In both intent and language use, Freud took aim at the Bible's authority to diagnose gender and sexuality dysfunctions and prescribe solutions for them. This was no innocent move. Throughout his career, Freud maintained the belief that the God of the Bible was a universal obsessional neurosis. I'll keep going. The 19th century category of sexual orientation reflects Romanticism's claim on epistemology, refining men and women from people who are made in God's image with souls that will last forever to people whose sexual drives and gender identifications define them and liberate them, supposedly, and set them apart as an improved model of personhood. Indeed, while the Christian maintains that image-bearing is what distinguishes humans from animals, the 19th century ushered in a new measure of man, one for whom the gendered object of sexual desire became the defining marker. Thus, Sexual orientation is a neologism and a new idea, and it creates fictional identities that rob people of their true one, male and female image bearers. But the category of sexual orientation moved sexuality from a verb, practice, to a noun, person, and with this grammatical move, a new concept of personhood was born. The idea that we are oriented or framed by our sexual desires, that our different sexual desires and different objects of desire made up separate species of people, and that self-representation and identity rooted now in sexual orientation and not in the purposes of God for his image bearers. Sexual orientation went from a categorical invention to heralded immortal truth in 100 years, taking away the concept of our being created in God's image and bearing an eternal soul in its wake. It is now a term embraced uncritically by believers and unbelievers alike. And what most people don't know and don't recognize is, again, where this has come from. This has come from fundamentally an atheistic worldview that denies God as creator and has created a substitute understanding of humanity. And humanity became understood as being, what it means to be a person is to be somebody who has innate sexual desires. And in order to be fulfilled as a person, you must be set free to express those sexual desires. Freud actually taught that to require anybody to constrain their sexual desires was abuse. Now, he didn't practice that in its full fruition, obviously, because if he would have, he would have actually gone so far as to say even something like pedophilia should be, totally and openly allowed. But in theory, that was exactly what he taught, exactly what he claimed. That he said the only problem with pedophilia, in a Freudian sense, is what? Consent. That's it. So you can see our modern practice of what do we understand and teach about even sexuality, that consent is the only boundary left. That started all the way back to Freud, if not before. That to tell anybody that you should resist your sexual desires, Freud would say was abuse. And of course, as we've seen in the last 100 years, that systematically one more cultural restraint has been disassembled time and time again. And so, you'll see there, quite significantly, since the Enlightenment, man has been determined to do away with God. The Enlightenment made this great declaration, God is dead. Well, the problem is, and yet in doing away with God, in their worldview, they have also killed man. Humans are now purposeless non-creatures. Therefore, what we do and why we do what we do, though perhaps it might be interesting from a sociological or psychological level, it's ultimately arbitrary, meaningless, and individualistic. By killing, by theoretically, in the world, by doing away with God, the dominoes fall, and you effectively do away with the uniqueness of humanity, the uniqueness of people. People are now nothing more than just meaningless, purposeless, non-created beings, and therefore there really is no meaning or purpose to anything that we do or claim to do, and therefore we can make up our own story. Because there isn't a larger story that actually informs our story. And the worldview kind of speech talk about meta-narratives, and we have big picture, big worldview, big stories of the world. There are no such things anymore. We all have our own story. And we can do that because we've done away with anybody who has the right and the authority to create and define and actually write the story that we are all a part of. Which leads us to what I'm suggesting is the next element to this, is a biblical survey. We quick skim over where we're at in our culture, a very quick skim over kind of how we've gotten here, which I would say that's Carl's books are primarily on that and helping us to see where this has come from, really dating all the way back to the time of the Enlightenment and Romanticism, which has led into the 18th, 19th century. That the 20th and 21st century, again, is just the fruit has just become ripened over what the seeds were sown hundreds of years prior. But when you think about the scriptures, when you think about the Bible, and most of you in the room, I have no idea who you are. Some of you may not even be Christians at all, may be unfamiliar with the Bible. But those of you who are Christians, that's fine. But oftentimes when we think about what's a Christian thought about this, it might be we just quickly jump to verses that talk about, or Bible passages or Bible verses that talk about what God has to say about being a human, or what God has to say about being a man, or God has to say about being a woman, or God has to say about marriage or sexuality. And we're going to go there before we're done. But I suggest, or at least certainly for myself, that there's a place to start prior to that. Because certainly in the last several years for myself, when I have had issues, whether it's issues in my own life, or issues in ministry, or issues in my family, or even just my own wrestling with what I'm seeing in the world and society around me, one of the things that just continues to just hold me in a place where I feel like there really is nowhere else to run, is that the Bible, try to understand what I'm going to say here, the Bible doesn't just simply, to me, the Bible doesn't just make sense. It does make sense. I'll talk about that in a moment. But the Bible makes sense of everything else. And I'm stealing that from a famous quote from C.S. Lewis. You see that in your notes, where he says, "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." And so what I'm meaning by that is, I'm coming to the Bible, to God's Word, and I'm asking myself, does the Bible offer any explanation as to why or how we find ourselves in a world that's so confused? And I think it does. I don't just think the Bible offers an alternative way of thinking about sexuality. I think the Bible tells us why we now live in a world that is confused about sexuality. Let me explain by pointing us to a couple of passages that I think many of us will be familiar with, at least the first one. And for those of you who perhaps are less familiar, we know that the Bible presents us with an account of, most of us know that the Bible presents us with an account of creation. God is creator and everything is the product of his creation. And on the pinnacle of that creation was mankind. God created people, a man and a woman, male and female. We kind of know that. You might even know that even at best from Sunday school. Fine. But the Bible, of course, doesn't stop there. And quite significantly, the Bible continues on. You'll see there into Genesis chapter 3, which explains that the creation that God made, which was good, what? Became broken. It's something that Christians call the fall. Man sinned, rebelled against God. What happened? The world, all of creation, including humans, became broken, fundamentally fallen. And here's the significance for us to think about, is that now people are broken, and they live in a world that's broken. Now, see if you can get the connection. So now I'm trying to make sense of myself. And I'm trying to make sense of the world I live in. What's the problem? The data, think about a computer. The data I'm reading is all broken because the world is broken. Not only that, but I'm trying to process that information through a mind which is what? Broken. Because of sin, because of the fall. So what's the outcome? Broken data, broken computer, broken results. I mean, in a statistical anomaly, a broken computer taking broken data can occasionally come up with the right answer. But generally speaking, it's going to, more often than not, what? It's going to come up with a confused, distorted, further broken way of understanding. So can a broken person understand themselves in a broken world? The answer is it's not possible. Not unless something else provides an explanation for the brokenness that surrounds them and their own brokenness in the world that they live in. So the Bible, actually, even from the very beginning, we're only up to chapter 3 of the Bible. Right from the very beginning, the Bible provides us with a picture of a world that we should expect to be broken. We should expect it to be confused. We should expect to see, and we should expect to see people, when they try to determine, explain, understand their own brokenness in a broken world, to come up with answers and explanations that will increasingly be distorted. The Bible tells us to expect that. A passage you might be less familiar with, and if you have a Bible, you're welcome to look there. I'm going to read Romans 8, not the whole chapter, but just a few verses in Romans 8, beginning in verse 18. Where the Apostle Paul tells us, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility." Creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. Not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit. So that idea that I painted, that picture I painted from Genesis 3 and the fall and the brokenness of the world, in Romans 8, Paul basically says exactly the same thing. That creation is broken, we ourselves are broken, and there's a future that will bring a resolution to this brokenness, but that's not the world we live in now. To add to that, another thing that's said in the New Testament, which I think is rarely thought about in this context, is in 2 Timothy chapter 4, where Paul's talking to Timothy in this passage about the importance of being faithful to preach the Scriptures. But he says in verse 3, "For the time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions, and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander off into myths." I see those, those are great explanations for the world we live in. Paul says, listen, there's going to come a day when people won't want to hear an understanding of truth that is sound. And of course, in Paul's understanding, sound is going to be that's shaped by the revealed Word of God. Okay, there's going to come a day where people won't want that. They won't want to hear that. What will they do? They'll never be neutral. That's not an option. The option when you don't want to hear a truth that's shaped by the Bible, the alternative isn't to just stay neutral. No, you always have to turn to something else as a substitute. Everybody has to. Everybody does. So what does Paul say? Paul says what people will do is that they will turn to other ways, other sources of teaching, other sources of information, other ideas that will what? That will suit their own passions. And when they do so, they'll turn away from listening to the truth and they'll wander off into myths. And so we live in a world that is broken. We are broken. Everybody in this world is broken. We, broken people, can't make sense of a broken world. And when broken people trying to make sense of a broken world turn away from the revelation that comes from the Creator, they turn to teachings, ideas, concepts that what? That are primarily about satisfying their own passions. Which goes hand in hand with that cultural survey we talked about. We live in a world today where it is almost by definition, one must satisfy their inner feelings. That's another word for passions. We must live according to our passions. We must. In fact, to not do that is to deny my own self. To not do that is to not be an authentic person. Those are the mantras of our day. Well, it's of course no surprise that it's not hard to find a growing chorus of teachers that will be more than happy to affirm that idea, that worldview. Because people are turning away from truth, not to neutrality, but to a pursuit of their own passions. And in turning to a pursuit of their own passions, they will desperately look for teachers that will feed, support, encourage that exact passionable living. Sigmund Freud is both a product of his own time as well as a contributor to the spiral in which we now find ourselves living. So, my first proposition, I guess, when it comes to thinking about the time in history in which we live, is to ask myself, does the Bible offer an explanation for why we live in a world like we find ourselves living? And I suggest it does. And I suggest to you that in that way, the Bible is unique to any other worldview, unique to any other world religion, unique to any other philosophy, because the Bible is brutally honest that people have rebelled against God, and a consequence of their rebellion is a further dismantling of their created purpose. And therefore we are not at all surprised to find ourselves living in a world where people are increasingly denying their created identity and living in a way that is pursuing their own self-identity, their own passions, their own internal feelings. That doesn't surprise us. If we know the Bible, we would say, yeah, that's exactly what we should expect. It's not that as Christians, it's not that doesn't grieve me, it doesn't leave me concerned, it does, but it doesn't leave me surprised. Or at least it shouldn't. In fact, if we're surprised, it's really, I would suggest, because we actually just don't really know our Bibles that well. This is not surprising, though it is grieving. And then the next question, notice how I said there, a biblical explanation of our moment. I put the word moment in there on purpose. I do have a great enjoyment and interest in history. You don't normally do a PhD in history unless you do. One of the things I like about history and studying history and knowing history is it helps to keep our particular time in history in perspective. Because oftentimes we can feel like our particular situation is worse than any other generation that's ever experienced, or we can think that this is kind of, our couple of decades of history is kind of the way things have always been and the way they always will be. But when you step back and look at the grand sweep of history, you suddenly start to realize that, frankly, I'm not even 50 years old yet, that's a pretty small blip on the radar compared to, the 2,000 years since Jesus was here and thousands of years the world's been around. So this is our moment in history. How long will this moment last? What will come next? I have no idea. Nobody does except God. But the Scriptures, the Bible, gives us an explanation as to why we are where we are. And it doesn't give us an anticipation that things are going to get any better until Jesus returns. But the Bible doesn't just stop at explaining to us the brokenness of our world and the brokenness of us in our world, the Bible also gives us an alternative. And I've worded this purposely as well. There's a biblical explanation for our moment in history, but the Bible gives us a timeless alternative. Meaning that what the Bible teaches us about God and His creation and what it means to be created by God is timelessly true. So it doesn't matter if it's our generation wrestling with the issues we're wrestling with, or whether it's our grandkids' generation wrestling with whatever they will wrestle with. The truths that come to us from our Creator are not limited or bounded by any historical time frame. They are timelessly true. You have another, I think it's the last quote. Well, there's two more quotes, sorry. This one's by a gentleman named Denny Burke, which I think is just helpful for us to. It says, debates about the nature of God, of salvation, and of the church never disappear, of course. But today, the most pressing heresies, the newest challenges for the church's teaching and mission, center on the nature of man. The tribulations that mark the 20th century and continue into the 21st, totalitarianism, genocide, abortion, and the sexual ideology that has battered the family and redefined marriage, have sprung from a faulty humanism. I don't mean to equate each of these human tragedies with the others, but they all spring from faulty anthropology, a misunderstanding of the nature of man. If we are seeing in our own time challenges to the truths that we are created male and female, and that male and female are created for each other in marriage, it is because we have lost sight of the true nature of man. We must respond to false humanisms with a true humanism, committed to the unique and irreplaceable value of each person. I'll stop there. There's a little bit more of the quote, but you can read that on your own. I want to look at some other passages, scripture passages in a moment. But to do that, I've included for you a definition there at the bottom of page 5 on the image of God. Let me read this. The essence of human nature is it's being created in the image of God. Man is being created after God in such a way that humankind is His image and likeness. The whole human person is the image of the whole deity. A human being does not bear or have the image of God, but that he or she is the image of God. The body is not a prison, but a marvelous piece of art from the hand of God, God Almighty, and just as constitutive for the essence of humanity as the soul. It is our earthly dwelling, our organ or instrument of service, our apparatus, and the members of the body are the weapons with which we fight in the cause of righteousness or unrighteousness. It is so integrally and essentially a part of our humanity that though violently torn from the soul by sin, it will be reunited with it in the resurrection of the dead. Here's the thing, when we think about Christians, the Bible teaches that humans have been created in the image of God. It's something most Christians have heard that, they've seen it in Genesis 1. But what we oftentimes, and I would suggest certainly my life growing up, I think Christians did poorly teach and understand how significant the body is to that truth. It's not that God has a physical body and us having a physical body is what it means to be made in His image. It's just that when God created people in His image, He created them as embodied individuals. The body wasn't an afterthought. The body wasn't something that was of secondary importance. Having bodies was something that was inherently part of the goodness of God's creation when He made man and woman in His image and in His likeness. So therefore, we ought to understand our bodies as being of immense significance to what it means to be a person. And therefore our bodies are not left up to us to, in a sense, determine what we will do with it or won't do with it, or what we will understand how it should be structured how it should be made. It is what it is as having been created by God. And this is who you are. And now, we do, in other settings we could talk about, but we're broken people living in a broken world. So in a broken world where there is sin, does that explain why sometimes people's bodies are broken? Yes, it does. So are people sometimes born with chromosomal disorders that therefore leave it, frankly, physiologically impossible to identify one's biological sex? Yes, that does happen. But that is a sad and grievous thing, and yet it actually is not surprising that that happens in a broken world. In a world that has come under the curse of sin, where we are born into this world broken, and therefore even our bodies are broken, we can't expect that, sadly, that will demonstrate itself in a brokenness that will be even at a very deep level of our physiology. But what we don't do is take those situations, which are sad and grievous, though they are exception, and we don't make those exceptions the measurement of what is normal. What was normal is what we see in the goodness of God as having created embodied people who have by biological definition a maleness and a femaleness to them, reflecting the good, orderly creation of God. And therefore we take our bodies seriously. And so as you look on those, the next page, there's a few passages. I won't look up all of these. We'll have some time to pause in a moment and let you fire some questions at me. But I've already referred to Genesis 1 and 2. Again, maleness and femaleness is part of being in the image of God. If you go back and read Genesis 1:27, God said, let us create man, let us create male and female. Genesis 2, the creation of male and female. You could just jump down to Matthew 19. Jesus, in Matthew 19, verse 4, Jesus clearly speaks of the origin of maleness and femaleness in God's created design. So, there are sometimes people might say, well, Genesis 1, maybe that's meant to be poetic and we shouldn't take it too literal. In one sense, that's not even a discussion to me that really is worth talking too much about, because we can just go straight to Jesus' words in Matthew 19. Jesus speaks very literally, very clearly, and he clearly affirms the maleness and femaleness having its origin in God's creation, as he refers back to Genesis 1. Psalm 139, a very well-known psalm to many Christians, and one that we often find a real blessing and encouragement. But of course, in Psalm 139, verses 13 to 18, David writes, for you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in the secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. Now you need to keep this in mind as to where this is in your Bible. God created man and woman in Genesis 1. Genesis 3, I already talked about. Man fell into sin. The world became broken. And unless you... What you don't want to think from that was, so that means after Genesis 3, God had no direct involvement in the formation of humans. Well, not according to Psalm 139. David is writing this as somebody who's living long after Genesis 3. And he's saying that God is intricately and instrumentally involved in his creation. So God didn't stop being instrumentally involved in creation after Genesis 2 or after Genesis 3. And so the physicality of our humanness is still a result of the purposeful creation of God. In Romans 1, two more passages we'll look at real quick. Romans 1, verses, in a context of a larger section, but verses 26 and 27, Paul says here, "For this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error." Clearly, there's a number of things in that text which can be chewed on, but Paul is clearly distinguishing something about a naturalness and an unnaturalness when it comes to the use of one's body in sexual activity. He's suggesting that there's a natural way of engaging in sexual activity, and then there is a way that is unnatural. It goes against nature. It goes against nature because it goes against the goodness of God's created purpose for nature. And then last passage is the text in 1 Corinthians 15, which again I think is a text that even many of us as Christians have not thought about as carefully as we should, because as the definition to the image of God that I read alludes to, our physical bodies and identities will continue to be part of our existence even into eternity. Paul teaches in 1 Corinthians 15 about a hopeful anticipation of, and if you're here tonight and you're a Christian, I hope you recognize that your biblical hope isn't to live for eternity as a disembodied soul. No. It's to be reunited with a new body. So physicality, our physical body, will be part of who we will be in the new resurrection, the new heavens and new earth. So that puts, again, a premium of significance, of value on our embodiment. Our bodies actually do matter. Now, not to the point that we worship our bodies, because this particular body, thankfully, isn't going to make it to the other side. But we will have bodies, and it will be us. And I have to admit, as a Christian pastor, I said there's mystery to that, what exactly that will look like and how exactly that will be. But we even see this, of course, in the resurrection of Christ, that Jesus had a physical body, and a recognizable physical body. And so therefore, a full-orbed biblical understanding of what it means to be a Christian living in this particular time in history tells us that we ought to take our bodies seriously. And we recognize that our bodies have been created by God, and that creation even goes right down to the very core of our physicality. As many have observed, that this idea of identity has unveiled a mindset in people that they're not just simply arguing against God, because most don't even necessarily realize that's what they're doing, but at a most fundamental level, they're actually arguing against the very core definition of their own DNA. You'd be hard pressed to push even further. Like, what's the next level that you can go to deny something that is so, again, objectively tangible as to the very coding of your own DNA? That we will say that is not reality, that we will create our own reality, that will go against something that is so fundamental. And what we're arguing on top of that is actually an expression of God's creation. And so to rebel or go against that is to deny our Creator. And enveloping all of that, as I've tried to, in a very brief amount of time, to help us to see that the Bible, the Scriptures, God's Word, the Word from our Creator, adequately addresses and explains all of that. Now, one still has to wrestle, are we going to believe that? Or are we going to continue to live as though that is not true? Well, that's a decision that each person is going to have to make. But to take the information at face value, one has to at least acknowledge that there is an explanation in the Bible that should be taken seriously. I'll pause there.